over 90% of veterans in the research that I have found identify as having a religious faith. And with that, over 90% of those say that they would like the opportunity to be able to discuss their spiritual and religious struggles in counseling. So one of the hugest things that I found, though, is that oftentimes counselors are either they're ill-equipped to help clients work through those struggles, or they're unsure of how to deal with those struggles. They're unsure of how do you incorporate this into session. But I think one of the key points is to keep in mind is that when we do psychosocial, and I often say spiritual assessments, is that we can't leave that piece of the person out of treatment, because the spiritual piece is a part of who they are.
Welcome to the Change Your POV podcast. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes of veteran mental health. I'm your host, Dwayne France. Let's get ready to make sure that your headspace and timing set correctly. Hey everybody, welcome to Headspace and Timing. If this is your first time listening, then thanks for checking us out. As many of you who serve know, the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal, is one of the greatest weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing isn't set right, however, it's just a huge chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my mission here, to raise awareness about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week we'll talk about different aspects of veteran mental health and interview mental health professionals that are working with veterans, service members, and their families around the country. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing show, a show where we're trying to change the way that you think about veteran mental health. I often say that we have a special guest on the show, but today is a very special guest because Dannette Patterson is someone that I very literally consider my mentor. Much of the things that I've been able to accomplish have been at Dannette's guidance or prodding, maybe, or encouragement. So, and I think that we may definitely get into the need for mentorship for all professions, but how important it is for veterans. But I think that Dannette has a very unique perspective about veteran mental health that you'll probably enjoy. So, Dannette, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Dwayne, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
Well, thank you for the last really couple years of encouragement. I mean, it's always important to have someone, and I kind of knew that before, to have someone as far as guidance and mentorship, but really to have the experience to help you grow. So I really appreciate everything that you've done for me personally, and also for coming on the show to share what you know with the guests here. Okay. So I'd like to maybe start out telling the audience a little bit about yourself and sort of your background.
Okay, so I'm a licensed professional counselor. Prior to becoming a licensed professional counselor, I was also a licensed practical nurse. So I've been in the healthcare field for about 20 years. I'm a former Army spouse of over 20 years as well. I currently work with the Military and Family Life Counseling Program, and I've provided services for service members, spouses, and veterans through this program for about 10 years. Prior to that, I had a private practice in San Antonio, and everyone knows that as Military Town, USA. And so the bulk, if not maybe 98% of my private practice was veterans, active duty service members and their families. And so so a lot of my research interests, as well as my clinical work, is around the military culture and how can we better serve the military culture as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that obviously you and I have had a lot of conversations about cultural competence and the need to learn that military culture, but some of the guests that I've had on as professional counselors were service members themselves, like myself. But I don't know that I've had a military spouse on before, but you have a perspective of the military culture that those who haven't served with or served themselves, that they probably don't have. How do you think your experience as a military spouse had helped you in your counseling profession?
Well, I think it helped me in a great deal, particularly as a military spouse. You know, I could say that I'm typically not a traditional military spouse. And what I mean by that is that I've worked throughout our entire military career. So a lot of the engagement in the FRG meetings and a lot of the, on installation activities very early on in our career, I wasn't a part of that. And so even though I was providing service, let's say in a military hospital as a nurse, I still wasn't really a part of the culture because I was more or less kind of separated from the culture, doing, forming my own identity, if you will. I don't think it wasn't until I actually got into counseling when I really, and this was about 10 years after being a spouse for 10 years, I really started to understand the military culture as a whole. Because when your spouse comes home, they give you little bits and pieces. They don't give you the whole story. And so oftentimes you're like putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And at that point, we're moving on to a whole nother new activity. And so I don't think it was, like I said, until I actually start working particularly at ACS, Army Community Service, and really sitting down, talking to service members, talking to individuals who've been working with service members for decades, that I actually begin to understand the military culture as a whole and what my role was, honestly, as a military spouse.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. You talked about, I don't think as a service member I did it intentionally, but we don't give everything, we don't explain everything, I guess, to our family members, and that leaves some gaps to just kind of try to figure out on your own, or not figure out on your own, a way to engage more, or even not engage, I guess, in that military culture.
Absolutely, now, prior to, I want to say maybe 2000, you can go into ACS as a military spouse. They would sit down with you and they would, give you some of the training as a spouse on the acronyms of the military, the ranks of the military, etc. Now everything is streamlined online, and that's just the way of the 21st century. But oftentimes I find that when I'm speaking to spouses, even in counseling sessions, very new spouses, they're even unaware that they have these options to take these courses online as well to understand the culture. So I think a huge piece of it is that one, the engagement, wanting to know more about what is it that my spouse does, right? And then the second piece is, okay, how do I get access to this information so that we can have this viable conversation together?
No, I think that's really great, and it's something that as a professional counselor for veterans more specifically, I know that I never really considered that until maybe about 8 months or a year ago. I was invited to participate in a group for military spouses that answered those kind of exact questions is, what does it mean? What does this mean? What does that mean? Because the spouses found it a lot easier to ask me than to ask their husbands. These kind of things, they're able to ask these questions of, well, why does he, look a certain way when a sound goes, whatever. But also it was easier for me to express to them maybe than it would have been to express to my own wife. And so I didn't have a lot of, emotional connection to these spouses other than my respect and their appreciation for what they did. But it was a place for them to go get their questions answered without having to ask their spouse.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that's important, particularly as a counselor, providing the psychoeducation piece. outside of just understanding the acronyms and the terminology and the rank, but just, being able to provide the psychoeducation in terms of, what does this mean that your spouse now has some hyperarousal? What does this, what do these terms look like, and how can you be of better support when we're looking at different areas that doesn't necessarily translate into, TBI, or doesn't translate into PTSD, but you do know that there is a shift in personality, there's a shift in responses. And so providing that psychoeducation to the spouses, I think, is paramount in helping with moving the treatment forward.
No, and as you well know, I have my own thoughts and opinions about things that go beyond PTSD and TBI and understanding those kind of things. And like you said, it's the psychoeducational, but it's just trying to get the information out there. Mm-hmm. So you not just are working with or having the lived experience of the military spouse, but you work with the MFLC program, the Military Family Life Counselor, whatever the acronym is. But I've seen MFLCs here at Fort Carson do some really good work, but maybe not a lot of people, definitely civilian counselors or maybe people that have gotten out the military a while back. They're not familiar with this program. So can you talk about that real quick?
Yeah, just real quickly. So with the Military and Family Life Counseling Program, we provide non-medical counseling. And so even though we're all licensed therapists, whether we're licensed clinical social workers, licensed marriage family therapists, or even licensed professional counselors, we're contracted by a separate contract that's contracted through OSD. Okay, there's a lot of contracts before you actually get to us. But needless to say, one of the pieces that I think service members as well as spouses enjoy about the program is that our services are confidential, and we're confidential to the fact that we don't take down any notes or any records of our sessions. So our sessions, can be non-traditional in the sense that they can be 2-minute sessions, or they can be up to 2 hours. So we can extend some time oftentimes you may not get, in a traditional chair. One of the other pieces about our program is that not only do we provide services to active duty members, but also to the Reserve and National Guard, and also for individuals who've gotten out of the military and their families within 6 months of separation. So we're there for those as well.
So it sounds very similar to Military One Source that many active duty members have access to, where they're able to reach out to Military One Source and actually receive counseling or therapy on the community off base at no cost, whereas the MFLCs are typically assigned to a unit or embedded in a particular unit, right?
Absolutely. And so what we find the difference between the two programs is that the service members, the families, they get to know us. So we're able to build a rapport. Because we do attend FRG meetings, we, attend, change of commands, we're out at family days, we're out at different events. So people are connected with who we are. They see us on the installation. And so after a while, once you begin to build that rapport, you're seeing them in the dining facility, you're seeing them at the gym, those different places. We have a tendency for people to reach out more to us because they've developed more of an informal relationship with us. So that helps build rapport a lot quicker. Another piece is that being on the installation, our reputation gets around. So you'll have someone who says, hey, you were able to provide a certain level of support, or you were very effective with, my neighbor and his wife. And so I'm going to pass your card on to someone else. So with us, they have a little bit more direct approach with us, but the programs are pretty similar in that. I will say that Military One Source is a really good place for resources, community resources. And so I often will, because outside of counseling, they provide a lot of information on helping individuals with jobs, schools, moving, all of that stuff that comes along with the PCS. And so we work pretty well with Military One Source, and will often refer individuals for them with using their resources as well.
See, and that's great. And this, maybe a little bit a mini soapbox here, a very small one, is it's great that the resource is there for active duty or for those that are currently serving or even past 6 months. But if somebody got out of the Marine Corps in 2005, they don't have that. There's very few similar resources for veterans. Whether even through the VA or through state programs or things like that. So I always try to focus the work that I do, especially through the nonprofit, is to say that we're trying to develop a similar thing for veterans that the active duty service members or those that are currently serving have.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, also, you recently you recently got your PhD. Congratulations!
Yeah.
This was.
Thank you.
I think I was doing something earlier today preparing for this, and it's been months, right? Just a couple of months.
Well, actually, probably about 6 weeks.
Yes.
Yeah, not quite too much yet.
So congratulations.
Thank you.
But but I'm very interested in hearing your topic of research. I know that you and I, again, having talked a bit, and we helped you out by promoting the research on the Headspace and Timing blog. I was able to do that and get that out there. But I'd like to talk a little bit about your dissertation and some of the stuff that you found.
Yeah. Well, before I begin, I do want to thank you once again for posting that on your site, because we got quite a bit of response from that. And so I really appreciate it. It really helped move the research forward. And so the title of my dissertation was looking at the impact of religion and spirituality on the reintegration needs of women veterans. And one of the primary reasons why I focused on women veterans in particular is because there's a lot of literature out on male veterans and how they adjust to civilian life. But when you look at the literature and you comb through the literature, you'll find that less than about 5% of the participants are women. And so that kind of, and I really say that because when I looked at a lot of the literature, you would find, like, let's just say, there was 100 participants. And so 5 of them were women. Or if you did a qualitative study, they would be like 20 participants, and 2 of them would be women. So it was a very low percentage of the female voice in the reintegration. And so what I found is that there was a need to explore this a little bit more in detail, because one of the biggest things that is kind of paramount for reintegration is that support system. And this has been found since, World War II all the way up through OIF, OEF veterans, is that having that group support is like the number one peer support, number one thing that helps veterans move forward. And so oftentimes throughout the literature, I found that women reported not having that level of peer support, particularly when they go to the VA. They would find that they would be, 1 or 2 women in a group setting. And so in that level of peer support, they didn't feel as comfortable as sharing. Sometimes, I've read a lot of reports where women felt as if they weren't recognized as a veteran, more or less kind of seen as a second-class veteran. So they would go to the VA and, say, it was great to see that you're supporting your spouse.
Right.
And that type of thing. And so in that, they, decide not to go to the VA. Oftentimes they would seek outside clinicians for additional support, or community health agencies, as opposed to utilizing the VA, so that they can get that support that they need. And so one of the things that I looked at when looking at religion and spirituality in particular is because what we found through our research is that oftentimes religion and spirituality, they're 2 separate constructs, but they can be also intertwined. And so we found that individuals who typically have a religious or a spiritual base can often transition or use that as a strong coping mechanism during stressful events. And so one of my ideas of looking at women veterans and the use of impact in religion was, is this used as a successful supplement, if you will, due to the lack of group support that they have? You know, what's actually for them to be successful? What's that building block, if you will? What's kind of like standing in the gap of not being able to actually have that formal support that most male veterans have?
So I see. I think that if the female veteran did not feel as connected relationally to a peer group, could a deep spiritual or religious connection replace that in supporting transition?
Absolutely. Because, you know, one of the things we look at with the religious support, those individuals who may score, you know, having high religiosity, is that, you know, they have not only a connection to a higher power, but they also have a tendency to have a connection to a group, because they're interacting, whether it's, you know, through service, through prayer, but they're actually connecting with others within that religious organization. You know, one of the pieces with the spirituality is that the spirituality gives you that sense for a need of meaning and purpose. And oftentimes we find for veterans across the board, whether it be male or female, is that meaning and purpose is one of the first things that is difficult in the transition from military to civilian life. And so I wanted to capture those two elements as separate variables to see how they, you know, correlated with women's healthy transition.
So you're absolutely right. I mean, I've talked about it before. Again, as you know, that's part of one of the aspects of veteran mental health for me that go beyond PTSD and TBI, is that existential aspect of it. You know, how do we find meaning and purpose? And I talk about it nearly daily with the veterans that I work with, and it's such a common thing. How did you measure that? How did you kind of understand the meaning and purpose and you know, the lack of it in transitioning veterans, maybe in general, or women veterans in particular?
Well, one of the things is that this was a quantitative study, and so I used, so to speak, 3 instruments. Well, one instrument was just the basic demographic questionnaire. And then I used the RCI, which is the Religious Commitment Inventory by Worthington. And that's like a very short survey, about 10 questions. And individuals who measure about, I want to say 35 or higher, are considered highly religious. So it asks you about your activity, far as, you know, reading books with your religious activity, attending services, those type of things that would say that you're actively involved in that. That's that religious commitment. The second tool I used was the Spiritual Connection Questionnaire. Now, this questionnaire was a little long, so I think that's where some of my participants kind of fell off a little bit, because it was 48 questions to that. This is by Wheeler and Highland, and in that's where the questions was really asked about the spiritual connection. And so looking at not only, you know, are you connected to a force higher than yourself, but do you have a sense of connection to other people? Do you have a sense of connection to nature, to your environment? So those kind of questions was kind of asked to measure the spirituality piece. And then the last questionnaire I used was the Military to Civilian Questionnaire by Sayer. And I strongly recommend this questionnaire to be used not just for research purposes, because it was developed for research as well as for clinicians to use in their practice. And so with that Military to Civilian Questionnaire, anyone, you can pull it up online. It's a free questionnaire to utilize. It was developed through a research by the VA, but it's by Sayer. So it's commonly known as the M2CQ, so Military Civilian Questionnaire. And it's a very short questionnaire, but what it does is it captures the veterans' experience within the past 30 days and their connection to their community, their connection to themselves, if they're having any difficulties on the job, if they're having any difficulties with school, if they attend school with their spouses. And then one of the questions on the military to civilian questionnaire also captures their sense of meaning and purpose. And so what I was able to do was to look at if a correlation actually existed between religiosity and successful civilian reintegration, and if a correlation existed between spirituality and successful civilian reintegration for these women.
Now that's great. Of course, I'm going to find that and I'm going to put that in the show notes so listeners can take that themselves. I wasn't even aware of that. So we learn something new every day. So I guess just in general, what did you find?
So what was interesting is, so we had 81 respondents to the survey. However, we had about 40 of those answered questions related to religiosity and the reintegration, and then we had around about 30 so answered questions related to spirituality. So it's interesting that some individuals chose not to do the spirituality questionnaire, but we had quite a few more that chose to do the religiosity questionnaire. I thought that was pretty interesting. One of the things that we found, though, is that with spirituality, so as individuals scored higher on spirituality, they also had increased difficulty in reintegration. I know. That's what I said.
Maybe that's a little counterintuitive. I mean, having faith in spirituality separate from religiosity, but I guess I would think that having more faith in a higher power, a higher spirituality would lead to more to an easier transition. But that's not what you found.
That's not what I found, and that's what I thought I would find, right? But that's not what I found, because one of the reasons why I thought I would find that is because religiosity requires, to some degree, that you're actively involved in an organized religion, where spirituality is more independent, individuality, and it doesn't necessarily require that. And so I thought for individuals who kind of feel a sense of out of place, in the civilian world, and then trying to figure out who they are as veterans, that the spirituality, that if they had a higher level of spirituality, in fact, that they would have a healthier reintegration, but that was not the case. I think one of the primary reasons as I looked at the research is looking at the impact of moral injury. Because the individual can, consider themselves highly spiritual. However, if they have endured a moral injury in the sense that they're questioning their spirituality or they're questioning their belief system, then I think they would have more difficulty in dealing with certain areas of reintegration as well, particularly as it pertains to the meaning and purpose.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was going to ask about if you found maybe some respondents who maybe at one point had greater connection to spirituality, but through their deployments. I guess in a lot of these, you focus specifically on recently separated female veterans, so OIF, OEF, OND veterans. Was there that I've heard that from my clients to say, I went into the deployment thinking about things one way and came out and maybe lost some faith.
Right. So as you mentioned, we focused on women who have recently separated from the military within the past 2 years. But one of the things is that because this was a quantitative study and not a mixed methods, those specific questions was something that I would have asked if I had a qualitative portion to that and be able to compare those results. That's something I'm thinking definitely looking at for future research, because those elements, when you think about moral injury and you think about, how many, not only how many deployments you've been on, but what type of deployments you've been to, how does that impact that reintegration, is some of the questions that you need to sit down and actually ask the participant one-on-one. And so that's for future research.
So,
That's
but
the next.
the next PhD, right? That's
Yeah,
your next...
yeah. No, just the next research.
So, but is that a sense of something that you've gotten from veterans that you've worked with? Because I do have that with veterans that I work with. They say they grew up in a faith-based household or a church-going, and then as young adults do go away from it, just typically, not just veterans, but then the experience of combat really making them question their faith in God or the higher power or their spirituality. So is that something you've experienced, I guess, anecdotally with some of the clients you've worked with?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I have experienced that quite a bit. And I've even found that, working with the chaplain has been significant in the work that I do, because oftentimes, even though individuals will go in to meet with the chaplain, and they'll say to the chaplain, hey, look, this is where I was, this is where my spiritual and religious place was. I'm not there anymore. I don't want you to pray with me. And they'll give the chaplain all of this stuff, right? And then the chaplain I've had chaplains that want to kind of co-counsel with me at times, because the soldier may trust the chaplain more than he trusts the counselor. But I think the chaplain I've worked with chaplains that understand that there's a need to bring both elements in, the counseling as well as the spirituality, because, you can very well see that there was some moral injury as a result of things that was seen, things that was done, their belief systems were shaken up a little bit. And so, I think being able to collaborate with chaplains when you do have service members that come in, or soldiers, veterans that come in with some level of moral injury, along with other mental health components, I think it's really good that if you can collaborate with someone from a clerical side to kind of help support you and support them along that way.
And I think that this can also be something for not those that are, like yourself, that are working with current service members, but former service members too. Is connecting with a faith leader in the community. There have been times where in the past where I've worked, the pastor of my church has reached out to me and said, hey, can you come in and talk to this men, mostly the times that I've worked, because they say, yes, we can do pastoral counseling or faith-based counseling, but there's other things here that maybe a more secular counselor or worldly, not worldly, but but someone less faith and more psychological based, but working in tandem with community faith leaders could help. I think that the spiritual aspect or the faith aspect of veterans' mental health, when we talk about veteran mental health, it's not often talked about.
Mm-mm. Not at all. And what I found, though, because I was looking through the literature with the collaborations with chaplains and with, like I said, those in the faith-based community. And what I found through literature is that, over 90% of veterans in the research that I have found identify as having a religious faith. And with that, over 90% of those say that they would like the opportunity to be able to discuss their spiritual and religious struggles in counseling. So one of the hugest things that I found, though, is that oftentimes counselors are either they're ill-equipped to help clients work through those struggles, or they're unsure of how to deal with those struggles. They're unsure of, how do you incorporate this into session? But I think one of the key points is to keep in mind is that when we do psychosocial, and I often say spiritual assessments, is that we can't leave that piece of the person out of treatment, because the spiritual piece is a part of who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, and I'll make a link to this in the show notes too, but I wrote an article probably well over a year ago now but talking about how to find balance in a veteran's post-military life. Physical wellness, of course, maintaining a level of physical wellness. Mental wellness as far as like cognitions and thoughts. Emotional wellness as far as moods and emotions. But then the fourth column that I had was spiritual wellness. And if you're very high on physical wellness and emotional wellness, but your mental wellness, you got a lot of negative thoughts going on and self-defeating thoughts. But then your spiritual wellness, however you define that, is less than optimal. Then I saw challenges. Is that sort of an accurate way of looking at it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the pieces too for clinicians working with veterans need to understand is that approaching, understanding the spiritual aspect of the veteran is not something foreign to the veteran. When you serve on active duty, the resiliency program that is built around the wheel of wellness has a huge component that deals with spirituality. Once again, spirituality is not boxed into religion. Religion can be a piece of that. But oftentimes when you look at it from the resiliency standpoint, it could be an appreciation of nature. It could be your ability to connect with the arts. And so understanding for clinicians who normally don't work with the military, knowing that in that resiliency piece that service members get across the board, spirituality is something that's often acknowledged throughout their career, and how that supports them and have positive coping mechanisms as well. So it's not foreign. They want to explore it in the counseling session.
And that's you bring up a great point in that it's not something that we're not familiar with. I think back to really all three of my combat deployments, less probably my 2 operational deployments, but definitely my 3 combat deployments. Chaplains would pray before a group went out, squad went out on a patrol or something, and they were there it was something that, the old phrase, there's no atheists in foxholes, right? As we veterans become more aware of our own mortality, because we're faced with our mortality, especially in some of the kinetic deployments, we start to question what's on the other side of that veil, right? What's on the other side of that wall. And so I very much recall having personal conversations with my soldiers about spirituality and religion and interpretations of the Bible or things like that. And so you're right, it may not be a major component of what they experienced while they were deployed, but it is a significant component. And I honestly don't recall anyone who stepped out before the chaplain prayed, because everybody's like, any port in a storm, anything that, could keep us safe. And our chaplain even went out on patrols with us sometimes, and things like that. And so you're right, it's something that veterans are familiar with, but it may be an aspect of something that that most mental health professionals, especially if not familiar with the military culture, are really aware of. Maybe they say, that's something that that's for chaplains, or that's for your pastor to take care of. I'm just here to take care of this aspect. I fix motors, I don't install windows, kind of thing.
Well, for counselors that would say that, I challenge them to look at the competencies, the CERVIC competencies, the association, the Association for Spirituality and Religious and Values in Counseling, because there's a guiding force. They're a division underneath ACA, and they provide the guiding competencies as to how counselors should address spiritual and religious and issues surrounding values in counseling. And so I challenge, counselors often to look at those competencies, and not only to look at those competencies, but to continue to grow in finding continuing education courses that will support them in being able to provide that additional support. Because it's something that not only just veterans require, but I think just for people as a whole require that in the session. We just have to be a little bit more equipped in how do we manage it, to the degree that we're remaining objective, non-judgmental, and just guiding our clients throughout the process and not imposing our beliefs on the process. I think is the most important piece.
Yeah, I think that's that's very important. Obviously, in any type of mental health counseling, this is one thing that I've seen with, maybe there are some colleagues in the community that have certain thoughts about, war or military service that they allow to creep into the counseling session. I think we've all heard of that, and definitely veterans have heard of that, and said, certain political views or anything like that that is brought in that's really detrimental to the therapeutic relationship. So it's very important that we have to be able to understand where we're at, and then do no harm, right? Do no harm. The ethical concept of benevolence and beneficence. So it's important for us to do that and kind of understand where we're at. What our beliefs. I mean, this is something that we mental health professionals often, I think, are outwardly focused, but there could be something to say about inward focus about where we're at and how we understand these things, so that we can provide the best care to our clients.
Mm-hmm. We have to keep in mind that it's their narrative, not ours. And so in understanding that is that, once again, how do they want to create or recreate a new narrative, not to fit, the scope of what we believe is true, but their truth. And I think sometimes, like you said, when you're dealing with things such as religion, that's the first thing they say when you go to a party, or you're in a business. We don't talk about religion and we don't talk about politics. Okay, well that's great for those places, but in counseling, this is their narrative. This is their story. So for me, everything is on the table. We don't take anything off the table because this is their story, not my story.
And I think this may be something that's very unique when it comes to veterans. I know that I've told you the story before about how I went to a talk with Irvin Yalom probably a couple years ago now, in which he had said that most clients don't typically talk about death or fear of death or mortality in their sessions. But in my experience, both military service members, veterans, and their spouses talk about it because it is a potential, right? It's something that's more potential and something more likely to come up. I was actually talking to a colleague. I think I talk more about mortality than I do, for example, sexual dysfunction. That's something that, it's another huge aspect of veteran mental health, but, they'll talk about death all day long. But maybe this is another aspect that uniquely for veterans, there might be a faith-based or a spiritual-based component of the sort of the therapeutic journey, or the, even understanding, coming to their own awareness about that, that it may be different culturally from those that have never faced those kind of events that would cause you to question, where am I at in this universe?
Absolutely. I want to add too that, the second question that we asked, looking at the religiosity and the reintegration, is that, individuals who actually had a higher level of religiosity had better reintegration. And so I thought that spoke volumes. So they had a decrease in reintegration struggles if they had a higher level of religiosity score. And so what I found interesting in that was, once again, that connection. I think you cannot go away from the connection that you have when you're in a group that's bigger than you. You know what I mean? When you're in a group. And so I kind of parallel those who have that religiosity and being in the military, right? Because you're a part of something that's bigger than you. You're part of a group. You're very collaborative. You're working towards the same mission, the same vision, and you have this team cohesiveness. And so you look at individuals who are, highly religious, will find themselves a part of an organization that's bigger than them. They're collaborating. Hopefully they're collaborating within those organizations, right? But they're collaborating within those organizations, and they're able to not only find their space, but find their voice, because they're all on one mission and one vision, whatever that organization is about. So I found that pretty interesting, that religiosity actually held up pretty well with reintegration needs.
So what I'm hearing, Dannette, is isolation is not good for reintegration.
Not at all. No.
We kind of know that, right? But you, even where you talked about female veterans early on, and I've heard the same stories too. Even as you were talking about it, I was thinking of a couple of conversations that I had, of which the female veteran went to, in this case, I think it was an active duty doctor who told her exactly that, so who's your husband and how can I help you support him? And she's like, she gave the bird, got up and walked out and said, because she was a veteran. And so, but there's that isolation, a sense of isolation in women veterans. It's not intentionally systemic, but it's almost systemic, I guess, as part of the system. I had one of my soldiers when we were in Afghanistan. I reconnected with her and we were talking, and I recommended that she reach out to the local, vet center or the VA. And a little while back, she said, I had to go to a VA that was probably 3 hours away. It's a different region because that's where they had the women veterans programs for me. They didn't have it at my local VA where I was, and it's a fairly decent sized Midwestern city. It's not like it's in the middle of nowhere, and so I think there's a level of isolation that if the veteran gets caught in that isolation, it causes more difficulties for reintegration.
Absolutely, and I think we're kind of like in this place where we're more the new age where people identify more as spiritual than religious. And so I kind of thought that, along the lines that spirituality would really carry people a good bit of the way. But I think this study kind of spoke volumes to the fact that, even though if you identify as more spiritual as opposed to religious, having that connection and being a part of an organization that identifies with your core values and your beliefs can really help you as you transition to civilian life. Just even though there may not necessarily be veterans that are in that particular circle, but there are individuals that can identify with your core values and beliefs. So I think that speaks volumes too to just what we know as counselors. The support system, having a support system is, one of the number one areas along with counseling, helping counseling move forward. And so So that was pretty interesting to see that.
I can imagine that someone with high spirituality, but a less of an inclination to connect with religion or less religiosity with a standard congregation or something that, like you said, they would have these questions, right? These unresolved questions about, am I a good person, or the things that I did that were bad, or these labels that I know you hear and I hear veterans put on themselves, but being part of a religious organization can help resolve some of that as well. Can help them understand that others make mistakes and there's forgiveness. If you're sitting in your own place, just having a conversation between you and God or your higher power or what have you, you're just sort of here in an echo chamber. But if you're interacting with other individuals, they can help resolve some of those concerns. Absolutely.
And so that's why I think it's so important for us as clinicians to kind of get an understanding of where people are, both spiritually and religiously. And how can we incorporate, once again, where they are, how can we incorporate that as effective coping mechanisms for them? And if there is some, moral injury, some religious or spiritual struggles, then how can we help them with, creating that new narrative for them that fits where they are?
Yeah, no, that is some very, it's very interesting. It definitely, and as you were beginning to talk, the idea of spirituality and religion in transition, that's a big subject. And women in transition, that's a big subject. But putting those two things together, helped narrow down a lot, I think, of a key aspect that may be missing in veterans transition. Mm-hmm. No, and you're absolutely right about having a support network, and you, Dannette, are definitely part of my support network and have been for a couple of years now. and I really appreciate you coming on the show and kind of sharing your insights. Any last thoughts? Anything else you'd like to kind of put out there?
No, I just want to, say that when we look at, women veterans, oftentimes they see themselves as the invisible veterans. And it was just so interesting. I had to share. This was so interesting. I was coming back from doing a conference at the ASERVIC conference talking about women veterans. And so I was at the airport getting ready to leave out of Virginia. And so a young woman had on a T-shirt that you normally get, for doing a fun run, with your unit organization. And she had her 2 kids with her. And I said, well, I want to, she was a Marine. And so I said, I want to tell you, thank you for your service. And so she looked at me and I said, no, I mean your service. I know that you are the Marine. She was like, so she gave me this big hug. She was like, oh my goodness. I'm like, I know you're the Marine, not your husband. You're the Marine. And so I think just, taking a different look at the roles that women play, not only, OIF and OEF, but just throughout history. Women have done great things within our country as far as providing service to the military and continue to do that. And so just acknowledging that and understanding that their needs may be a little bit different, and how we can actually get to understand what their needs are so that we can support them in the way that they have supported us.
No, you're absolutely right. The service of female veterans is often underreported. People have often asked me about my thoughts towards women serving in combat, and as I think I've told you, the argument about women in combat was solved the minute, and probably even much longer ago than that. But I say the minute that my driver, a female specialist, dismounted behind me in a village in Afghanistan to make sure I didn't get shot in the back. I served with and honestly lost a non-commissioned officer in our company who was a wife, a mother, but also an excellent soldier. And so you're never going to hear any arguments about me that women can't hack it in combat because I've seen it there. And I think there's a big... like you said, they're so silent that, or not so silent, but they're not heard so much that when somebody does actually ask them the questions, they're eager to tell their stories. Mm-hmm. And I'll link I'll take the poll out because your survey is no longer active, but I'll put a link to that episode or that article in the show notes because it's still probably one of the 3rd highest viewed articles on my website because it is specifically focused in all of the participants in women's veteran study, and it had huge reach and dissemination because women veterans want their voice heard. And so I thank you, Dannette, for making sure that that's out there, that women veterans have a voice. And that they're able to at least explain what they were as far as part of the combat in the past, not just couple years, but over the last 3 or 4 decades. Mm-hmm. So if people wanted to hear more information about what you do, do you have a website, Twitter, social media? How can they reach out and say, hey, I want to hear more about what you're doing?
Well, I don't have a website. I'm a little too old for Twitter, I think, but I need to get on Twitter at some point. But I'm on LinkedIn, so if people want to connect with me professionally, they can find me on LinkedIn, just Dannette Patterson, and they'll see me there. But that's where they can find me for the most part. Right now, I'm just currently doing some adjunct teaching, and so eventually I'll be at a university at some point. That's my goal. And so, but if they want to reach out to me, they can always reach out via LinkedIn.
Better you than me, developing the next generation of great counselors. I'd rather be the guy on the ground.
Boots. Okay, Dwayne.
Thank you very much, Dannette, for joining us today. And listeners, as always, thank you for taking the time to spend with us. We really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next week.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created mini-me's. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
So there you have it, folks. Another episode of Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to changing your perspective on veteran mental health. I'd like to thank Doc Todd for giving us permission to use the track Not Alone from his amazing album, Combat Medicine. Doc's a guy who's trying to bring the discussions about veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you need to check him out. Head over to therealdoctodd.com to purchase the album and support the cause. You're not alone, veterans. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created mini-me's. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick. Guys, take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain. Stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.